Travis just has a intensity to him where you're never wasting time. We're all here and we all have too much work to do than we have time for already. At the same time, we were working like hell. During my internship, I want to say we raised $1.25 million on a $4 million valuation pre-money. Just going to be by hiring the smartest people we can and giving them as much responsibility as we can, because that's just, I think San Francisco is doing about 1,000 trips a week. We were one of the very early billion-dollar fundraisers. We were putting a lot of money in the bank accounts, but the valuation being associated with the company was accelerating even faster. But that is dependent upon hiring good people. On one hand, we did not envision it looking like it does today. Like, we didn't even have time to really think too far in the future.
Hi, this is the second part of Uber story with Dom, who has been with Uber since its inception days. If you haven't watched the first episode, please watch it. In this episode, Dom will deep dive into the very early days of Uber. He will discuss in detail about the team culture, the growth mindset, and how Travis was an aggressive leader. And you will realize how Uber became one of the hottest startups of all time.
Can you talk about how big was Uber at that time when you joined again? And how was, I believe Travis already became the CEO, as you said. How was Travis as a person, as the leader? How did he operate, and how was his execution style? How was the team culture and around that? Can you talk in detail?
Yeah, so when I came in full-time, a number of things were different. The company had grown a fair amount. I'm going to make up some numbers here because I don't remember exactly. I think when I came in full-time, my employee ID was number 17, but a couple people had already left. So if there were 14 or 15 people at the company, that sounds about right. 5 or 6 of them in engineering. If I try hard, I could think of the names who were before me, but it was something like that. I was probably number 6 or 7 on the engineering team. In a couple months prior to me coming in, Uber had launched New York City as its second city, still kind of with just the black car business. And so we were in 2 cities at that point, which is pretty big, but still just the black car business, still English, still USD as the currency, kind of all these pieces. And I don't remember exactly what the trip count was like, but if I had to guess, just order of magnitude wise, I think San Francisco is doing about 1,000 trips a week at this point. So, substantially more than the 100 in a weekend that we did when I left, but obviously it still pales in comparison to today. But 1,000 trips a week, I remember being pretty surprised by the size of it. New York was tiny because it was just 2 months in, so it was much closer to that, tens to hundreds of trips a week at most. The early couple cities we launched really took a long time for us to figure out how to grow. We got better at it over the years, but it was just a long, slow growth curve early on. And at this point, I think we were still, I don't exactly remember how the driver supply worked. I think for the most part, we were still paying, I think there were drivers who we were still paying hourly to make sure we had someone online. But I think that at least in San Francisco, we were starting to get some real volume. I think that new drivers we were onboarding were just being paid on a per trip basis. And so I think maybe it was just legacy drivers we kept on. I can't remember exactly, but we were starting to shift into this world of it just being the per transaction model that it is today, because that happened as cities got to a volume of riders that could support, a growing driver base. Some other feel of the office early on. At this point, we had also, the company was already in its own kind of dedicated office space by the time I had come in. We had a nice office a couple of floors up right on Market Street in the middle of San Francisco. I won't make up a number, I'm bad at square footage, but it was small. If we were kind of sitting on each other's laps by the time there were probably 30 to 40 of us and we moved to our next office a year later, but it was that kind of space. There were mostly open seating and a couple conference rooms, and Travis had an office kind of at the end. Because it was one of those buildings that was like a kind of a really sharp angle to come into Market Street. And so he had, an office that had 270-degree windows, which is kind of cool. But Travis is not a closed office kind of person, with the exception of when he was meeting with investors, raising rounds or something like that. But for the most part, he was the kind of manager who was very involved in everything going on. He'd walk the floor, he'd talk to people. If you had real meetings on the calendar with him, maybe you go to his office, but doors open and kind of, not that anyone would jump in at any time, but kind of had a feel that everyone's contributing to really anything going on, any decision making, any whatever. Sometimes he really would pull people in. I remember some early early branding kind of conversations that were happening. Like I happened to be close to his office when he was talking to this designer, this contract designer that we had, and he like pulled me and someone else I was next to it and was like, what do you think of these renders? How does this look? We're, changing the font on the Uber name, stuff like that. But it was all very collective, but also very urgent. Like Travis just has a intensity to him where like, you're never wasting time. We're all here and we all have too much work to do than we have time for already. So let's like cut to the chase. Let's not really dance around things. Like if there's decisions to be made, let's do them. Let's never like talk about making decisions or like planning to plan on something. Like either you do something or you don't. And there's an efficiency we need because there's just so much to do. So many different directions to operate in. A specific anecdote that a tactic of his that I loved and I kind of picked up is, you'll hear cliches these days around management that's like default to action or default to doing. The way he would do this is if he like needed an answer on something from someone, I would say he would always try to position himself where he's never blocked by someone else. So you would get an email from him that would say, hey, need your perspective on this or need your thought on this. If I don't hear from you, I'm doing this thing. So get back to me by, tomorrow afternoon or whatever. And so there was always a decision to to move forward on something. And so that was an idea that really everyone kind of adopted, right? It's very effective, right? You email somebody, say, I want your feedback on this, but if I don't hear from you, this is what I'm doing and why. And so I'm not going to even allow myself to fall into this trap of you blocking my work because like we don't have time for that, right? Like this stuff has to happen. And so there's there's kind of an urgency, there's a vibrance to that comes from that kind of environment, which is kind of exciting, we still at this point had some people who would stay late or work weekends if they wanted to. It wasn't required, but while you're in the office, you feel like this hum because everyone's driving at this mission. It's important. At this point, cities are popping up and we've got regulatory issues happening, but like Travis there as like a steady hand, but also that intensity that isn't like backing down to some of these challenges. Everything feels surmountable. It was a very exciting environment to be in.
Oh, wow. Yeah, so super exciting times, I believe. So if we talk about how growth oriented the team was and how you started like operating in different cities, right? What was the strategy of like, okay, we'll open in this city or go international? How did you go about? How was the first international city story behind that?
Absolutely. So it's interesting. So maybe to give a little bit of extra context for what tech industry companies were like at this time period, kind of early Uber. I'll put some bookends on it, maybe 2011 through 2014 or 2015. Like most of our peers in the tech industry, most of the other companies that were kind of similar size were almost exclusively kind of digital only tech companies. It was the Mints of the world or the Squares of the world, and kind of, I guess Square may be a bad example since they did have physical card swiping product. But for the most part, these are like tech companies building digital products, that interact with people primarily over the internet, and then like that's kind of it. Whereas we had a different thing going on, right? Like our business grew by real people in the real world, like doing physical things, like getting in a car or like driving their car for 6 hours today, like doing this thing. And so there's this different geo-local, hyper-local, which kind of became the buzzword, limiter on growth, really, in a way that like a purely digital product doesn't have. And so our growth strategy had to be very different. We would like to pretend on the engineering side that we could just build something once, kind of deploy it out to the world, and then away we go. But it was never quite that simple. And then similarly, as a company, like we had to figure out tactically, how do we decide where and how to expand next, right? Because it takes literal people on the ground to launch a city. And so there's no playbook for this. We had to come up with what this looked like. We ended up developing kind of this strategy that revolved around having a launch team. We called this the launch team. They were people who basically became experts at doing the preparatory work before we launched a city, but then they would also be the first boots on the ground to literally launch the city. And so the priority list of how we launched cities where was some magic formula of, size of market, onerousness of the regulatory environment, maybe something around like local taxi, NPS and kind of public sentiment, stuff like that. Eventually later, we had metrics like, well, how many times are people opening the Uber app in that city already, even though we aren't there? So we had some more qualitative pieces. But eventually we ended up with like a big, list, kind of a priority list of cities to launch. And we kind of went down them one at a time, or I guess I should say with as much concurrency as we had people on the launch team. So if you were a launcher, you were assigned launching Chicago, you would fly to Chicago and you would find some co-working space, whether this was kind of before WeWork, but it was those kinds of spaces. You would rent a desk there. You would hire a general manager, a driver operations person, and a community manager. And so GM ran the city, driver ops managed supply, community manager managed riders. Maybe while you're doing interviews for those roles, you are finding the first drivers. You're calling limo companies and you're saying, hey, I have this product. How does this sound? Can I interest you in turning this thing on, signing up your drivers? You're also finding your first riders. You are learning about what makes this city special. What holidays do they have coming up? Today is St. Patrick's Day. It takes someone who is familiar with Chicago or familiar with Boston to say, you know what? St. Patrick's Day is a huge day for these cities. Chicago turns that river green. If you didn't know that, you got to do some research and say, well, this would be a great thing to build an event around. Let's throw a party themed for this thing the city cares about. It feels local. And this is going to be kind of a pathway for how we introduce this app. It's a startup. It's a tech company. It's from San Francisco, but it's not really from San Francisco. It's from Chicago. It's going to be local. We're going to hire local employees. They're going to find local drivers who are going to drive around local riders. And yes, the launcher came from somewhere else, but they kind of tried pretty quickly to turn this over to local experts, because the perspective was we didn't want a hubris of thinking that employees in San Francisco kind of knew what made every city special. And that had some real implications for engineering for sure, but it also just had implications broadly for how the business ran. And so this idea of standing a GM up in every city, having them be like a little CEO responsible for their own operation, for their headcount, doing a full P&L statement, budgeting, and all of these pieces, that was structurally a design for speed of execution. Because yes, we had launching limited by the size of this launch team, but once the launch part is done, the way we were going to grow fastest was by pushing as much autonomy down to these individual city teams to figure out how to grow as possible. And what this looked like, just to give a quick example around something really concrete, is when we would do a company all hands every week, once a week. Most of that all hands was going around the call digitally to have individual city GMs talk about their cities and put up a slide in a template that they filled numbers in for basically how their last week's numbers were across all the core metrics: rider signups, driver signups, total number of trips, revenue, stuff like this, and how that compared to the last 6 weeks worth of numbers. And if the numbers were green, they were expected to tell everyone what they did that worked well. And if the numbers were red, they were expected to tell everyone the mistakes they made and what they were doing to fix this. And so that just became it was on every city to really own that and understand that individually. And then, on engineering, we had our own feedback loop, figuring out how we were facilitating the needs of different cities, or how could we build, some efficiency in common platforms, part of our challenge. But this was very much the way the business is going to grow is just going to be by hiring the smartest people we can and giving them as much responsibility as we can, because that's just going to be the best that we can do early on.
Oh, wow. So what I get from this is essentially you give super high amount of ownership to the local teams and give freedom to execute.
Exactly. I think that's exactly right. But that is dependent upon hiring good people. You have to start all the way back probably all the way back to when you put the job rec up in the first place, the text you put on there and the things that you're looking for in a candidate. If you're going to put this person in charge of a city, in charge of the P&L, you're looking for a different profile than someone who's going to be, a cog in the gear sitting in a desk, somewhere far away from the operation. And so it's about finding the right people, finding really critical leaders and innovative people. And then once you find the right people, yeah, set them loose. Let's not we hired smart people for a reason. Let's not overly constrain them. And to be clear, we got this wrong a number of times. The original 3 people on the New York City team, the original GM, the original driver ops, the original community manager, it didn't work out. They were not the right people for the job. The job wasn't right for them. We ended up replacing all 3 of those people, and then the second iteration worked really well. New York really took off. Same thing happened when we did Paris, our first international city. Had that same playbook, the first 3 people we hired, the GM, driver ops, community manager, just didn't really work out. We missed a bunch of. Paris was very different. It was different on a bunch of dimensions, which we can talk about. But the first team didn't work. It didn't really. This city didn't grow. It had trouble taking off. When different people came in, we learned a lot. We learned how to hire. Learned some different things we needed from that organization. And it's amazing. It's easy sometimes to wonder, like, what does a senior manager do? Like, what is a real impact? This was like, you replace those people and that thing just took off because we found the right roles for that job. And so yeah, it's about autonomy, but it's about having hired and brought in and filtered candidates for the people who can rise to the occasion that autonomy is going to require.
True. In the initial days, like, I'll go a little bit back. In the internship days and the initial, like when you joined full time, in the initial days, did you and the team actually believe that Uber will end up becoming so big? Was the vision so huge? Just wanted to get an idea of what's going on in the mind of those initial set of people.
Yeah, it's funny. It's a couple things. On one hand, we did not envision it looking like it does today. I think it was 3 years of it being a black car luxury thing only business. There wasn't the option of car types, though we had some experiments. It took a while to get to an international city. And so there's like a dimensionality to the product now that exists that we couldn't even have dreamed of early on, eats and freight and all of these pieces. At the same time, early on, having seen a pretty visually exponential growth curve of like rides and revenue, there was, it did feel like we were doing something. We were onto something here, right? Like, this is a product riders are choosing to use because it works. A product drivers are choosing to use because it's the best use of their time. And so there was a sense that like this thing was really gonna go and gonna keep going. For a number of years early on, I had the pleasure of doing the last slide in the company All Hands, and it was a slide that just had 3 numbers on it, and it was total trips for the previous week, total drivers online in the previous week, and total revenue for the previous week. And then I think had some percentage change from the previous week, from the previous week from its previous week. This was a way to kind of keep the company up to date on kind of what we look like in aggregate. But it was also a way to just like visually see this curve over time. And so I did some other slides, like when we broke 1 million trips a week for the first time, and some milestones like this. But sometimes I would do some fun projections of like, if we had the last 6 months of growth curve for the next 7 years, like that's when we pass the GDP of the US, right? Like truly like nonsense calculations. If you run these growth curves out long enough, like, you surpass the GDP of the planet, which is mostly tongue in cheek. But it was kind of to highlight, like, we don't really know, like, we don't know where this will go. Presumably growth slows at some point. It has to by definition, because Uber could not be 50% of the US GDP. But at the same time, like, we're not really seeing the slowing yet. So is it going to be next week? Is it going to be next month? We got to try real hard to make sure it's not. But like, there was really kind of no end in sight for much of those early years. I would then also caveat that by saying, at the same time, we were working like hell. There was so much to do. There were so many cities to launch. Engineering was, systems were falling over. We couldn't keep up with the growth curve. So as I reflect on those times, I do think I tend to talk about it as if like we didn't even have time to really think too far in the future. Like, we couldn't really do, yes, I do my fake 6-year projection and we're bigger than $14 trillion. But like, we didn't really have time to think, sit back and like drink over beers and be like, oh, this will be $100 billion business in 4 years, or this will be $1 trillion business in 6 years. Because like, there were too many problems to solve yesterday or tomorrow. And so it was kind of limiting on how much, at least as a peon, as a little frontline engineer, we didn't really talk too much about that. Yeah, for sure, as we grew as a company, part of maturing as a business is having, kind of strategy and planning, and having parts of the finance team that are doing some real projections and doing some growth. And, that feeds into fundraising and all that stuff. But at least for someone who is not in any of those roles, we didn't spend a lot of time thinking about what success would look like in a couple of years, just that it felt good right now. But my God, do I have a lot of work I need to be doing to make sure the system doesn't fall over tomorrow.
Great. Do you remember during your internship days and when you joined, what was the valuation of Uber? Interesting.
Let's see. So when we raised our seed round during my internship, I want to say we raised $1.25 million on a $4 million valuation pre-money. I'm going to make up these numbers a little bit. I'm probably going to get them wrong. I don't remember the round that happened when I was not at the company, when I was my senior year. I want to say that would have been the Series A. I want to say the Series B was a $12 million raise on $60 million valuation. And then I think the Series C was that was when it started to get really crazy. It was like $100 million raise at $1 billion valuation, or 2 billion, 3 billion, might have been 3 billion, something like that. We had an interesting mechanic where the dollar amounts we raised were getting huge. It was pretty common in this era for a fundraise to be at about 20 or 25% of the company's valuation, just as you're looking around broadly. So if you were raising $10 million on a $40 million valuation, actually similar to our seed, right? Seed was 1.25 on 4. We kind of had a different mechanic, a different growth happening. The business was accelerating so fast and was so desirable for investors that Travis and the team he put together to do investments really got to exact really preferable terms from investors. And so you started to see the dilution associated with the round really come substantially down. So I'm making these numbers up a little bit, but if that was $100 million raise on a $3 billion valuation, 30 to 1, substantially different than the companies that were doing 25% dilution, right? We diluted 3%. And that only kind of continued. If we were not the first, we were one of the very early billion-dollar fundraises. At that point, it was at a 20, 30, $40 billion valuation. But so we were putting a lot of money in the bank accounts, but the valuation being associated with the company was accelerating even faster. And so, it kind of took off. I'm sure I got some of those numbers wrong. Good listeners could look up the history on it. But I think the key piece was, that seed funding was 1.25 on 4. And then it all took off from there.
Wow. And you were getting 1% of that.
I turned down 1% of that. Yeah, but that's interesting though, right? So if that was a $4 million, maybe a $5 million valuation at that time, because you add the money raised to the pre-money valuation, I was offered 1%. I was offered 50 grand, 50 grand in equity. I mean, that's not nothing. I don't know. That's not something to write home about, Especially if there's a chance it goes to zero, a pretty good chance it goes to zero. Obviously it was only years later that we realized it did not in fact go to zero, right? But yeah, I mean, that's, the numbers are interesting, especially at those small scales.
I hope you enjoyed this episode. In the next episode, we'll discuss in detail about multiple roadblocks that Uber faced due to very weird regulatory conditions in some of the cities, and how Uber took a firm stand and challenged those rules. If you liked this episode, then please do like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so that you get notified when the next episode is up.